Welcome back. Working on puzzles one more time. Eventually, I hope to have a much higher score than this. But the ultimate goal is to get to recognize all these patterns. And I think this is just a checkmate here, isn't it? There's a check. The king has to move. And then I remember from a different puzzle on the other side that I have to go this way for it to be made. The bishop is protecting that square. Okay, now I remember in the other puzzle I pulled back thinking that was mate, but then the pawn can block. So here I have to go over one, I believe. Then that pawn can block, but I can take it. Okay. Now I go back. Okay. Now when the king moves, it doesn't really matter where my rook goes because that will be checkmate, except for the pawn move, which I would block. 2080. Oh, 11? I got 11 points for one puzzle. Did I? Oh. Well, it says that the target time was 36 seconds, and I don't think I took much longer than that, so okay. Attacking castle to king. Sorry, I'm looking at the themes here to make sure that they're right. Discover check. Mate in 3. Yeah, pretty close. Rook's on the 7th, I guess. And windmill. All right. Well, the themes were basically correct on this one. Okay. That one was easier than this one. Let's look at our checks first. There's this check, which they can't block, but the king can move to one side or the other. And I do have a follow-up. Either way it goes, I could pick off this pawn, and it would still be check, regardless of which way the king went. But I don't know how much more of a follow-up I would have. For example, if I checked here, and the king moved, and I checked again, it could either come back, try to do some sort of a repeat. Oh, no. If it went that way and I checked again, I would be forking the rook. So the king would want to come here so that the rooks could protect each other. But then I wouldn't have much. Well, I could come back then for the follow-up, which would force the king to the back rank again. But I don't have a path to getting that, because anytime I line up to get this rook, the king can come off the back rank. I think. I'm not seeing a path to mate there. And if it went the other way, kind of a similar thing. Now that way, if it went that way and came back, I could win the rook with check, and that would be pretty good. But I'm not incredibly sure if that's the right way to go, because I think it would go the other way. Because this way there's a path to escape eventually. Like it might be this path, but then the king gets out. That's what I'm thinking. So if I checked on e6, the king would move to d8. And then if I captured on f6, right then the king wouldn't go on to c8 because I would take the rook with check, I think. But it would come to d7, so I couldn't take the rook. And I couldn't check here because of this knight in the middle. And I could check here. And then when the king went back down, I could take the rook. Okay, so that's one path. Some checks that eventually win me this rook, if I followed that out correctly. And one of my troubles is visualizing beyond. Like, I can picture my queen right here on the next move. And I can picture the king moving there while my queen is here. But then once it gets beyond that, I have trouble picturing, even with the arrows, of like which pieces remain, which pieces are whatever. And I also don't know if winning the rook and a pawn is a big enough goal for this puzzle. Because once I win that, the king comes out here, and then I have to move my queen out of danger of that rook, of the b-file rook. And then there's going to be some sort of trade down here. No, there's not going to be a trade down there. There's going to be a very close to a checkmate down there. Because my queen's going to be over here someplace. They're going to check me. I'm only going to have one move out. Then they're going to take the rook with check, maybe. And if I capture back, they're going to knock off my bishop. There's going to be a lot of killing down there. Maybe. I don't know. I could take the queen right now. And the knight could recapture. But then I don't have much else. And at first I was seeing this threat here, protected by my queen. But I think in that instance, I think the knight just picks off my bishop, and I'm in check. So that's not good, I think. Yeah, I don't see how that's good. I cannot capture this knight right now. There's this bishop here too, and I'm wondering if the inclusion of this bishop in the puzzle is significant. If it wasn't pointed right at that knight, then it's kind of a misplaced bishop. And that makes me wonder about this idea that I had about coming through here, checking here, forcing the king back to the back rank, and taking the rook. This bot f7 was always unavailable in that scenario to my queen because of this knight. So that makes me wonder if I shouldn't take the knight first. Or, once I have moved my queen here and taken this pawn, then at some point it might be handy to take that knight, because the d-pawn would be forced to capture it, and I would be pretty close to having an open file here for this rook. Because once that d-pawn's off, and remember my queen's over here someplace, then all that has to happen, say if the king happened to be there at the time, then there's a bishop move with discovered check from the rook. So I think it's best then to save this for later and do the queen first. Well, yes. Okay. Obviously, because if I do that now, I just lose my queen. Okay. And I have to keep in mind that this is coming at some point. Although it's not a mate threat immediately, because I can just get away. The knight's hanging at that point. And then there's always a path out, I think. So I am going to move the queen in to e6. Okay. Oh, and it went that way. That was unexpected, because I thought that in my initial evaluation of this, I thought that it had to go that way, because here I definitely win the rook. Unless I'm missing something. Because obviously these other checks don't make any sense. So I'm pretty sure it has to be this. And then the king has to go one way or the other, because my queen cuts off all three of those squares in front of it. Oh, the knight could block at this point. That's one reason that it would go that way, is because when I take the pawn, the knight can block. And then the knight is protecting the rook. Okay. See, that's what I mean about not being able to visualize like a move or two ahead. I can visualize the queen, I visualized the queen being here and the king being on one of those two squares. But I knew that square was off limits for my queen, but it's only now sinking in that the knight can block check there. However, I still think that's the best move. I think. Because I don't have any other checks. Now do I take the knight? Is that what the bishop's here for? I don't know. I do know that if I go here, if I capture on f6 first, check, and the knight blocks, I was going to say I could follow with this check, but the pawn would just take it, wouldn't it? But then I would have the rook coming in here, guarded by my queen here. And the knight would be pinned, and I would be directly threatening the queen. But I don't know if that's good enough because of this. Oh my goodness. Sorry, I just bumped the desk with my chair. Okay. I think I have to take the pawn, though. There's nothing else works, really. If I take this first, they can take back with this pawn. Then I could still check, but I've given up a bishop for a pawn. No, I haven't given up a bishop for a pawn. That's just a clean trade. But then here I would win the rook for sure. I'm going to... Oh, if I take the pawn first, the knight blocks. And then what do I have? Do I take the knight first or do I take the pawn first? If I take the knight first, they're not going to recapture with the d-pawn because the queen would be hanging. So if I take the knight, they're going to recapture, one assumes, with the f-pawn. Then I check and definitely win the rook. That's what I'm going to do. Oh. Okay. They put me in check by slipping forward because then they would be able to take with this pawn because they've unpinned their queen. And now I need to move out of check. Because I can't block it. I can't block check. And I don't have any piece right now that can take their queen. That was unexpected. So I did make the right move for my plan, but I didn't expect that. I expected just the pawn to recapture my bishop. So now I've got the bishop is hanging. I've got a bad exchange hanging here. And I'm in check. Okay. But there's got to be a way out of this, or it wouldn't be a puzzle. I can't move forward to a4 because the knight guards that square, and obviously I can't go toward the queen on the diagonal. So I have two choices, b2 and b3. And since the puzzle is still waiting on me to move, that means one of those moves is definitely better than the other one. Now let's say b2. This comes with check, but I take it back, and then I'm out of check. And out of danger, I think. Because in any follow-up check from the queen, I could just escape. But it could also check over here if I went down. But then I could just go further, one way or the other. What about b3? That is out of check as well. And there is a follow-up, but then the knight's hanging. No. There's no follow-up there because of my bishop. So if I went... If I move to b3, looking all over for a follow-up, there is this, which could force a queen trade. I think, yeah, I would... Oh no, the pawn's there. Oh, good grief. So there's not that. So maybe b3 is better, because there are at least 2 follow-up checks if I go to b2. There's that exchange that comes with check, and there's that check over there on a4 with the knight. Not to mention the queen just coming forward would be a follow-up and continuing to guard the knight. So b3 is better. I'm going to go to b3. And I'm going to wince just a little bit just to prepare myself in case that's wrong. And that was it. Okay. Woo-wee. That's that's only 2 in a row for this this session, but 10 in a row for including my last couple of sessions. So I'm pretty pleased with that. And since I haven't hit 20 minutes yet, I'm going to click next. And that might be a mistake, but we're about to find out. Okay. But one thing I have learned is that with very careful consideration, I'm doing pretty well on these when I just look and take an extra minute, even if that's boring for the viewer, because remember, I'm not doing this for you. No offense. I hope you're enjoying it, but I'm doing this for me. Okay. They have a very advanced passed pawn down here on the e-file, protected from behind by the rook, because rooks belong behind passed pawns. My poor rook is in front of the passed pawn, which is not the greatest place. I have a couple of checks. There's this bishop giveaway check here. And I think that is just a giveaway, because the king could take it. The queen could take it. The king could just move out of the way. The rook could take it, but I think that's the least likely because it quits protecting this pawn. And if pawn gets this far with the rook behind it, that's more valuable than 1 point right now, especially with my king right here. So it almost might be worth it if the rook was the only piece that could recapture to get this pawn, to give up the bishop for the pawn. But the rook isn't the only piece that could recapture. The rook can stay where it is. The king captures or moves out of the way, or the queen captures. So that's not a good check, I think. It's nice to have it, just in case. And also this bishop is blockading another passed pawn. I have multiple checks with the queen, too. This one on a1 kind of puts my queen in the corner. And this pawn is protected, the b pawn is protected by the rook, so it's not like I could come back and pick up that pawn on the way out after the king moves out of check. This check doesn't really threaten the rook either because the queen is protecting the rook. So this check, I mean, the rook wouldn't move to block, obviously, because I would just take it and follow up and then be picking up this pawn. So I think, in that case, the king would just move out of the way. So I don't know that that's best. Neither of those checks seem very effective in any way. And obviously, and I already discounted this one, I think for obvious reasons. I do have a couple of threats, I guess some stronger than others. For example, moving a bishop here to threaten the rook. I think the rook could just move, though, to any of the dark squares here. It could even move here behind this pawn, and then if the bishop came back, the rook could just move again. There's a pawn threat on the queen, but I'm not sure exactly what that would do. I think, wouldn't the queen just move over one or down one? If I threatened the queen, it would just move down, and then it would be protecting this pawn from the side in case something happened to that rook. Or it could just move over and continue protecting this pawn. This doesn't threaten anything, right? I think the queen just takes it. And then the queen stops guarding the d-pawn, but that doesn't give me a whole lot for a bishop. Okay, so those are the only real threats that I see. Threatening the queen with the pawn, threatening the rook with the bishop. This bishop has just moved down here, and that's got me curious. I guess it's threatening that pawn, but that's not that important, is it? Right now in the grand scheme of things. Also, I don't see a way to check and end up, because this bishop's unprotected, so I'm looking for a way to check and then swing back somehow to be threatening this bishop, but I just don't see that right now. Like with this check, no, because I can't guard that pawn's not guarded. So then does that make sense to threaten the rook to get it to move? And then check and hit this pawn? I'm lost. I'm missing something obvious, or not obvious, but I'm missing it. Whether, regardless of the degree of its obviousness, I am missing it. That check, the king just moves. I don't have a dark squared bishop. I don't have a path back, say to here, to check it again from there. I guess at that point I would have like this, but that's not even threatening mate because both of those pieces guard that pawn. And this, same thing. That threatens the bishop, but then it just moves, right? It does line me up with my bishop, though. But then where does this bishop move? Something like that? And then what? That's not good because they have three pieces guarding that pawn. So even with the queen behind the bishop, that doesn't make sense. Okay, well, it was a mistake to click next on this puzzle. I'm going to pause the video and continue looking at this for a few minutes. Well, one thing I noticed while I paused is something I didn't see before, which is that this rook can move if it needs to, because my queen is also guarding the promotion square. So for example, if I wanted to move the rook here to threaten that bishop and also threaten check, they couldn't then just advance the pawn protected by the rook, because my rook could take it, and if they took back, I would have it. That's one thing I wasn't considering rook moves before, because I thought, oh, it has to stay in front of that pawn. But it doesn't necessarily have to stay in front of the pawn. So it can move here. That was one thing that I definitely wasn't considering. So I'm going to consider that now. My rook can go to c8 to threaten the bishop. And it is still from here, guarding the promotion square along with the queen. So if I moved my rook to c8, the bishop would have multiple places to go. One, it could go here to continue guarding this pawn. I don't think it would go there because I could capture it. It might go here to guard the square that my rook would then be pointing at. Possibly. Or it could go back even further to here or here. I don't think it would go all the way to h2, because that takes away an escape square for the king. But from h2 it could block any checks on the back rank. So maybe that's where it would go. So I don't know if that's any better than any of the other things that I came up with, like putting the queen here, for example. One reason that the bishop might have come here was to go to d8, to not only protect the pawn, but to trap my rook. So that's another question. That might be where it goes anyway, after I move my rook. If I move my rook to c8, the bishop might just go to d8. And then my rook would no longer be pointing at the promotion square. That's interesting. So yeah, that's something else that I saw, and that doesn't look really great, because then what do I still only have the options that I had before, but without the option of my rook blocking this pawn. So I'm going to pause again. Okay, I've thought about this some more, and I think I'm back to possibly threatening a piece. For example, the queen with this pawn. And my reasoning for that is that the only thing protecting the rook is the queen. And I think this would qualify as removing the defender. Because then there would be no space left on this diagonal for the queen, which it has to be on to protect the rook, I think. Because I'd said earlier it might move forward to protect this passed pawn. It might move in front of the pawn to continue protecting this one. But either of those squares no longer guard the rook. And the rook was the major piece that I could fork with this check if the queen weren't guarding it. So that's my candidate move right now, is deflecting the queen off of this diagonal from protecting the rook. Because it can't move here to continue protecting the rook due to my bishop. If I move pawn to f5, I'm not sure exactly where the queen would go. It would either move forward to help protect the passed pawn. It would either move over to continue protecting this pawn, or move here, although that doesn't seem quite as good. Actually, it might move there because that would guard that square, and then this fork wouldn't be as powerful anymore. Right? If I threatened the queen and it went there, it's not really the fork that I was looking for because it can block with the rook. White can block with the rook at that point, protected by the queen from h4. Well, that's frustrating. I'm going to do it, though. I've spent too much time on this puzzle. If I lose points, I lose points. That wasn't it. Okay. I'm still higher than I was when I started this video, so I'll keep it. But let's... I'm going to go to the retry puzzle, and I'm going to hit the hint button and see what it was. Was it one of the moves that I looked at? It was to do that now. First. Then the king moves. And then this. Oh, I'm in check. And then that would take me, and I would take this pawn. Okay. Clicking on the analysis bar, which, oh, it looks like this was actually from a game at some point in 2004. Okay. The first move was this bishop coming down here, which was a blunder. So who knows what Argio's reasoning was to move this bishop down here, either that or that. But then there is only one good move for black, and it was that, which was the first move that I considered in this game. Okay. I mean, in this puzzle. And my idea was that the king goes here, and then there's nothing I could do. And then later I spotted this, but I thought I should have done that first. Now, white has several choices. In the puzzle, they picked the second best one, which was this. And then I take the rook. And then that's their next best move to get rid of my queen. Which it says they would take back with the bishop, but then oh, now I'm in check, so I have to move out of check. Then what do they do? Okay, well, I got close. I got close to figuring out, because I had considered this move and this move, the one I eventually decided on. I just did them in the wrong order. I thought it had to be this to dislodge the queen from the diagonal first. But you know what should have turned me off of that is when I noticed that it could go here to guard a rook block. That's what should have told me that this had to be first. Because that's pretty much all that white could do at that point. Then I could dislodge the queen from that diagonal. Yeah. And then at that point, it has to go either to f4 or g3 or g5. Because at this point, it doesn't make any sense to go to h4 because it's not going to guard anything there. Okay. And either way, I would take the rook. And either way, it would go for the check to basically force a queen trade. Oh, and it says if we did it... Oh, now it's saying they would take with the pawn. That's weird. Stockfish can't make up its mind. Also, it's Stockfish 11 for some reason. That's weird. Well, this says 12 here. But up there it says Stockfish 11. Okay. Well, thank you for watching. We got a few points in this session. I solved 2 puzzles and failed 1. We'll see you next time.